Story 1. This story is about something that happened to me and a friend when we decided to take a hiking trip in the woods near our town. The forest was dense, thick with trees, and secluded, exactly what we were looking for when we wanted to escape from the noise and stress of everyday life. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the air crisp and fresh, and began our trek into the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the forest floor and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, but there was a strange stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. By mid-afternoon, we found a perfect spot to stop and have lunch. We sat down, eating and chatting, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. After all, it was just the woods. But then, we heard something. It started as a soft whisper, distant, almost like wind through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. The whisper sounded like words, though I couldn't understand them. I looked at my friend who was staring into the trees, pale-faced. I asked if he had heard it too. He nodded, his expression grave. "We need to leave," he said quietly. I laughed, assuming he was just being dramatic. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Go back, go back," it seemed to say, as though it was being carried by the wind. My heart began to race, and the sense of unease grew stronger. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we stood, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the woods around us became unnervingly silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness. We began walking back down the trail, but it felt like something was following us. Every time we turned a corner or looked behind, we couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was just out of sight, watching us. The path was getting harder to follow, like it had changed somehow. The trees looked different, more twisted and menacing. I remember feeling like we were walking in circles, even though we had only been on the trail for a few hours. At one point, we stopped to take a breather. I turned around to ask my friend something, but he wasn't there. I called out to him, but there was no response. Panic set in. I searched frantically, shouting his name, but it was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. I was completely alone. Then I heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it was much closer. "Come closer," it beckoned. Terrified, I backed away from the sound, my heart racing as I tried to find my way out. Just as I was about to give up hope, I heard my friend's voice. "Get out of here now!" I ran toward his voice, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally found him. He looked just as shaken as I felt, his eyes wide with fear. He told me he'd heard the same whispers I had, but worse, he'd seen shadows moving between the trees, and something had grabbed his ankle when he tried to leave. He barely escaped. We didn't waste any more time. We ran the rest of the way out of the woods, and as we reached the edge of the forest, the whispers stopped. The air returned to normal, the sounds of the forest resuming, as though nothing had happened. We never spoke about it again, but the memory still haunts me. The feeling of being watched, the whispers and the shadows that seemed to move in the trees. It was as if the forest itself didn't want us to leave. Story 2. This story is about an experience I had a few years ago when my friends and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in a remote forest. It was a place we'd been to before, a secluded area deep in the woods where people rarely ventured. It was quiet, peaceful, and we were excited to spend a couple of days disconnecting from the world. We arrived just before dusk, setting up our tents and a campfire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew cold quickly, and by the time night had fully set in, the only light we had was from the campfire. As we sat around, telling stories and joking, I noticed that the forest was unnervingly still. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, and it felt like the trees were closing in around us. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the cold or the unfamiliar surroundings. But then it happened. One of my friends, Jake, pointed towards the edge of the clearing. "I swear, I just saw something move in the trees," he said, his voice tense. At first, we all laughed it off, thinking he was just imagining things. But then I saw it too. At the edge of the light, just at the periphery of the fire's glow, there was something moving. It wasn't an animal, too tall and oddly shaped. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing still between the trees, as if watching us. We all stood up, staring in the direction Jake had pointed to. There was no sound, no wind, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The figure didn't move, just stood there, still, like it was waiting. We called out, but it didn't respond. Slowly, we all began to feel uneasy, the hairs on the back of our necks standing up. And then, without warning, the figure stepped into the light. And I wish I could say it was just a trick of the shadows, but it wasn't. It was tall, over 6 feet, but unnaturally so. Its limbs were too long, its posture twisted, like it didn't belong in the shape of a human. The face, I don't even know how to describe it. It was dark, shadowy, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight, and it was staring right at us. We froze, unable to move or speak. My heart pounded in my chest as the thing in the trees slowly began to step closer, each movement deliberate and slow, as if savoring our fear. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it directly at the figure. It hesitated, as though the light hurt it. But when the beam hit its face, it seemed to vanish into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. There was nothing but the trees and the stillness. My friends and I were in shock, unable to speak for a few moments. We quickly packed up and decided to leave the campsite immediately. The hike back was terrifying. Every time we stopped to catch our breath, we felt like we were being watched. We heard footsteps in the woods, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. We eventually made it back to the car, and when we looked back at the forest from the safety of the vehicle, there was nothing unusual. The trees stood still, as they had before. But I knew what I had seen, and so did my friends. To this day, I have never gone back to that forest. There are whispers that the place is cursed, that something ancient and malevolent roams the woods at night, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into its reach. Story 3. This story is about something that happened to a friend of mine, Ben, a few years ago. Ben was always the adventurous type, someone who loved to hike alone in the woods to clear his mind. He had a reputation for being fearless, but after what happened to him, he changed completely. It all started on a crisp fall weekend when Ben decided to go for a solo hike through a forest known for its rugged trails and dense trees. The forest wasn't particularly well known to many hikers, and it wasn't on any official maps. Ben was drawn to it by its mystery and the idea of exploring somewhere off the beaten path. He arrived early in the morning, the sun barely peeking through the treetops as he began his hike. The first few hours went by without incident. The air was cool, and the sound of his boots crunching on the fallen leaves was the only noise in the forest. Everything felt peaceful. Too peaceful. Around midday, Ben took a break by a small creek, resting on a large rock. He had packed his lunch and was enjoying the solitude when something caught his eye. At the far side of the creek in the trees, he saw movement, like someone standing still but watching him. Thinking it was another hiker, Ben called out, "Hey, you lost too?" There was no response, just silence. Ben figured the person didn't hear him or didn't want to be bothered, so he shrugged it off and went back to his lunch. But something about that figure in the trees made him uneasy. It wasn't the way it stood, more like the way it didn't move, unnaturally still, almost too still. After a few more minutes, Ben stood up, grabbed his gear, and decided to continue his hike, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But as he walked deeper into the woods, something began to feel wrong. The trees, which had once seemed so inviting, now looked like they were closing in on him. The path he was following seemed unfamiliar, like it had shifted. He checked his map, but the trail didn't match anything he had seen. The markings weren't where they should be. The farther he went, the more the woods seemed to change, becoming darker and denser. Ben tried to retrace his steps, but no matter how much he walked, he couldn't find the creek again. He called out for help, but the only answer was the distant echo of his own voice. He was lost. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Panic started to set in. He hadn't planned to be out this long, and now he wasn't sure if he could find his way back. As night fell, the woods took on a sinister quality, and Ben began hearing things, rustling behind him, footsteps that didn't match his own, and whispers carried on the wind. Then, just when he thought he might make it back to the trail, he heard it, a soft, faint whisper in his ear. His heart skipped a beat. "Turn around." Ben froze, blood running cold. He slowly turned around, expecting to see someone. Maybe another lost hiker, but what he saw was far worse. In the distance, barely visible in the dim light, there was a figure standing in the trees. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs and a face that was barely there, just shadow and darkness. It was staring at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The figure didn't seem to breathe or blink. It just stood there, watching him with that terrible, hollow gaze. Ben panicked and turned, running as fast as he could, his legs trembling beneath him. The forest seemed to twist around him, the trees narrowing as he sprinted, the whispers growing louder and louder. He didn't stop until he broke through the tree line and into an open field. Only then did he dare to look back. The forest was still silent. The figure was gone. Ben managed to find his way back to his car and drove out of the forest, his hands still shaking. He didn't speak much about what happened after that, but from that day on, he never hiked alone again, and he never returned to that forest. A few months later, Ben heard something from other hikers. Others had gone missing in that same forest, some even saying they heard whispers just like he had. The worst part? Those who disappeared were never found.